we're going to learn how to achieve that low poly look that is so popular, and we're going to do it in Cinema 4D. Okay, so I already have a little bit of a scene set up here for us, and I'm just going to do a quick render to our picture viewer by hitting Shift R to show you kind of what I have set up. So when we're first viewing this, you can see that it kind of has the beginnings of one of those low poly look things, but it's not very faceted looking. So it doesn't really look low poly, even though these kind of have that low poly feeling to them. This definitely doesn't. This feels almost realistic besides this big hole that we have there. So really needing some help on how to make this look low poly. So first things first, whenever you're trying to set this up, you need to be able to see how many polygons are actually there. So going into your display and turning on Garo shading with lines might slow you down a little bit because it's so much to calculate, but it is going to make it more obvious that you have too many polygons, especially in this case. So I'm going to go into that scene drop down, and I'm going to go to that rocky underside and open that guy up, and you can see that I've got my little platonic shape in there. Now if I zoom in, you can see that I really only need this face right there on the platonic. So I can turn down those segments all the way to 1, and that's going to give it a much more low poly look. So let's see what happens if I do a quick render to my picture viewer now. Okay, so the edges of it look much more faceted and low poly, but the front side of it still looks pretty smooth. And the reason for that is because we've got a Phong tag. Now a Phong tag is going to be present pretty much any time you create any sort of primitive. So I've got this circle up here, and you can see, or rather this sphere, and you can see that it came with a Phong tag when I created it. Now, just a quick tip on spheres, whenever you go in and you delete the Phong tag, it looks here like it's going to be fine and dandy, but whenever you render it, you can see it's still going to be perfect. And that's because with a sphere, it's always got this render perfect checked on. So you have to uncheck that and delete the Phong tag to get the low poly look. So I'm going to go through and delete those Phong tags from everything we see here because we do not need them. They are not doing us any favors. So I'm going to delete it from the platonic. I'm going to go in and delete it from my mountain. And you could see a little bit of a change when I deleted it from the mountain. Now, another reason why the mountain looks so smooth is because it's under a subdivision surface. So I need to turn that thing off for sure. And you can see that whenever I render that now, with the Phong tag on and the subdivision surface turned off, we're really starting to get some nice results. Now, you can turn the subdivision surface off, or better yet, you can actually just go in and drag it out from underneath the subdivision surface and delete it. So that's just one less thing to have in your scene. Okay, so I've got my mountain, but one of the things that you might notice is that, you know, in our platonic, we were able to go in and turn down the segments because it was still technically a primitive object. It just had been placed underneath a cloner. Now my mountain has been baked down. So I can't go in and just reduce the poly count on that like I could if it was still a primitive landscape object. So what I need now is a deformer, and that is going to be the polygon reduction deformer. So that is going to really give us a lot of help. So I'm going to drop that in and then drop it underneath that mountain. And you can see instant success. We've got some really cool looking polygons here, and I can come in and start playing around with that reduction strength. And you can see the higher I reduce that, the more abstract that it's going to get. So maybe not quite that much. I can turn that down to maybe like 95%. Very cool. Okay, so now I can go in and play with that more, but because of something that we're going to do a little bit later, I'm actually going to bake this one down. So just so we don't forget, we'll go ahead and select our mountain and our polygon reduction, right click and choose Connect Objects and Delete. And actually that didn't do exactly what we wanted. We'll just go in and do current state to object first, and then we'll delete our mountain and polygon selection, and then we'll just have that one left over and get rid of it. So now I've got this one, and it's all baked down and ready to go. And that's going to be really helpful later once we start talking a little bit more about cloners. But before we do that, I want to show you a really cool little deformer that you can use besides the polygon reduction deformer. So we did that one on our mountain, turned out really good. There's another one you can use called the Displacer. So this one is going to help you to get some really kind of crazy effects if you want something to not look so perfect. So I'm going to use this on my platonic. So I just dropped that in, placed it under the platonic. You can see it did get a little crazy looking, but that's okay. We're just going to come down here, and I'm going to go to shading, and we're going to change our shader to a noise. And then what I can do, you can see we got a little bit of a change there. I can go into the object and start playing around with the height. And the more that I increase that, the crazier and crazier that is going to be displaced. So you can see that's starting to really make those kind of look distorted. And it's just a good way to be able to kind of achieve something that looks a little bit different than your typical polygon. Now these are going to drive me crazy. So I'm going to turn those off in my visibility here. I can go into my filter and choose generator, and that's going to turn those off, but it's also going to turn off kind of everything I have going on there. So I'm just going to turn that back on, and then for now we'll just uncheck this guy. That way if we have any other generators we want to work with, we can do that. And in fact, there is another one that I want to work with here. And I'm going to be talking a little bit now about MoGraph. Now, this isn't necessarily something that is going to help you achieve the low poly look as far as actually getting a reduced poly count and then making it render to look that way. But in these low poly types of illustrations, you very often see a lot of duplicated little objects. So I want to show you how to do that with a couple of different techniques. So the first one I want to do here is with this cloud. So I'm going to turn this on. I've already created kind of this low poly cloud for us to play with. And I just want to show you how to use MoGraph to kind of populate your scene with some clouds that look like they belong in a low poly shot. So we'll go up to MoGraph, add a cloner, and I'm going to drop the cloud underneath the cloner. And then instead of letting the cloner default to linear, I'm going to change that to radial and then kind of pull this up here. You can see that it's not quite the right radial we want. So I'm going to change the plane to the XY plane. Then we can turn up our radius a little bit, and already that looks pretty good, but it is a little too perfect. So let's go into our cloner and add a random effector. So I'm going to go to MoGraph Effector Random, and that's just going to drop that random effector in up there. And what I want to do now is kind of just come in here and make this a little bit more random by coming into the Y and kind of changing that. We can turn on our scale and turn on that uniform and absolute scale options, and then start to kind of change and play with the scale. We can go into the cloner, maybe increase our count a little bit so we get a few more clouds. And that's really going to start looking like we've got some random clouds in here. Maybe even come in there and reduce that Y just a little bit so it's still there, just not quite so much. And maybe a little bit more in the X. Very cool. Okay, so now we've added these clouds to a cloner and really quickly achieved a pretty random result. Now what happens if I want to clone something across the surface of this mountain? Well, we already did the first step in making sure that our mountain was all baked down. We weren't going to have any funny business with our polygons there. So I want to show you how to clone across the surface of the mountain. So we'll go in here and add another cloner, and I want to clone my tree this time. So I'm going to turn on this little tree. You can see I have this tiny little low poly tree I've made, and I'm just going to drop that under the cloner, and we can rename that to tree. And this one, instead of setting it to radial like I did before in the mode, I'm going to change this to object. Okay, so now I don't see anything yet because I haven't selected the object. I'm going to choose that mountain and drop that in. Now that is going to create kind of a look of a dead heap of trees basically. So we need to uncheck that align clone, and that's going to allow those to be in the correct orientation, but there's still way too many of these. So I'm going to change that from vertex to surface. And so now these are going to just be distributed kind of along the surface here. And I can come in and increase the count of those if I want to have just a few less there. And I've also got this house that I built earlier that I want to be able to kind of be just sticking out of the side of the mountain there. But you can see my tree is kind of in the way of the house. So what I'd like to do is create a selection that will allow my trees to only be in that area. So basically what I want to do is select everywhere I want the trees to be and then paint away the areas that I don't want them to be. So I don't really want them to be at the top of the mountain or right here where that house is. So what I'll do is select the mountain just like this, and we'll go in and grab our rectangular selection, and I'm going to go into the polygon mode. And yes, make sure everything is selected like this, except I'm going to do it more kind of like that so that I've just got the bottom, because I don't really want anything growing up too high in the top. And you can see that the only select visible elements is unchecked. That way I can select the back part of it too. Okay, now just to make this a little bit easier, let's turn off our tree cloner and our house again so we can kind of see what we're doing a little bit better. And I'm going to switch over to my live selection now and paint away, holding control, the areas around the opening here that I also don't want to contain any trees. Okay, so kind of right through there. Now everywhere else, I'm happy with trees being there. So what I'll do is now create a selection tag. So with this selection, once I'm happy with it, I'll go to select and go to set selection. And that's going to create this polygon selection that I can rename to tree line. So that's where I want my tree line to be. And then I'll re-enable my tree and my house. And now in my tree cloner where it says selection, I'm going to grab this selection and drag it into the tree line selection. And you can see that that kind of took away the trees there on the top, and any trees that were kind of interpenetrating with the house are also gone. And now I can go in and increase the count, and no trees are going to grow in that area where I don't want them to. Now that looks kind of silly. That's way too many. So I'm going to kind of pull that back down to a more reasonable number. Great. Okay, so we've got some trees using MoGraph. We've got some clouds using MoGraph. And now I'm going to kind of come in here and show you some other things. So just to recap really quickly, we learned about deleting the Phong tag. We learned how to use two different deformers, the polygon reduction and the displacer, to kind of add some different little things there for just working with those polygons. And then we learned how to use MoGraph to kind of populate a low poly type of shot. Now, I also want to show you some other things with the materials that are also going to really contribute to this type of look. So I'm going to go in and create a material for the landscape. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in here, and I'm going to turn off my Garo shading with lines and just change it to Garo shading. So that's going to kind of help this be a little bit less busy here. And what we want to do is basically make a different color happen on every single one of these faces. So I'm going to go into create a new material and open up this material, and I'm going to turn off the reflectance because I want this to look really matte. And instead of just changing the one color here, I'm going to go into my texture and change this to a gradient. And then I can go into my gradient and maybe add a few colors kind of along the way here. And I'm going to do just kind of some browns And then maybe like a way lighter one kind of right next to that. And then a dark one again. Then maybe like kind of a golden looking one. And then maybe like a really kind of dark orange one over here. Okay, so I've got like a really crazy looking gradient here. And what I'm going to do now is drop that onto the mountain. And you can see that because we reduced our poly count and did kind of all this crazy stuff to it, it's mapping on there just as best that it can. And it really gives you that awesome, every single polygon is a different color look. So when I hit Shift R to render to my picture viewer, you can see that that is starting to really have an awesome look to it. Now I already applied some materials, just some simple ones of some glass and just a simple gradient onto that house there. But let's create a couple other materials for kind of this bottom area and the tree. So I'm going to do the same thing. Let's just kind of practice this. So we'll go into our color, add another gradient, and let's do this one for the tree. So I'm going to do like a really dark green and then kind of like a middle green right there, and then like a really light one. Maybe even kind of take it over into the yellow side of things. Okay, cool. So let's drop that onto our tree. I'm going to do it right there on the lower tree. And you can see how we get a really neat little gradient that kind of moves around it like that. Now, if this looks a little too smooth for you still, you could go into your material and play around with your mapping in your gradient a little bit. So maybe instead of that 2D you try something like diagonal. So that's going to give you a totally different look kind of right away. So I just did a quick little render a moment ago just to see what this looked like. And you can see it's okay. That's kind of what it looked like before when it was linear. And then we'll see what the diagonal one looks like instead here. I'll pause it just to let this kind of move through. Okay, so you can see this gives it a little bit better effect of just making it feel a little more faceted just by changing the mapping up slightly. Okay, so then I'm going to create one more material that's going to be for the underside by just going to gradient again here, and we'll just drop in a few colors. And this one I want it to be way warmer and kind of more almost look like lava, because you kind of see that a lot for the underside of these things, because you're really just picking something that's kind of you know, a sort of a representation of what all these different elements are. So I've got this material, and now I'm going to drop that on the rocky underside. So we'll get some really cool color there. And I kind of want to play around with this gradient a little bit because I wanted it to be more red than that. So maybe I come in here and sort of pull this over so the red is taking up a lot more of this image. And you can see this gradient isn't really mapping in the same way on these that we were seeing before whenever we had that, you know, like kind of like what we have up here on the mountainside. So to get that look to be a little bit more on those facets like that, what we can do is actually come in and use both the displacer and the polygon reduction. So I'm going to drop that under that platonic, and you can see that 90% might be a little bit too much. So let's turn it down to like 20. And let's switch that with our displacer. And you can kind of see that we can kind of start to get a little bit of a different look by doing that. Okay, so let's move on from materials for a moment. I'm also going to turn back off that rocky underside for a second here, just so we can move around a little bit more quickly. And honestly, now I kind of have this area here. I sort of like it even without that a little bit. So if you don't want to have something that is, you know, that populated down there at the bottom, by all means, it's up to you for how you want this to look, because this base pyramid is really cool too. So maybe if I want to just drop that on this guy and use that instead for the underside, it is going to run a little bit faster for us here. So maybe we'll just work with that for a minute. So I'm I'm going to kind of talk about something else now that we really have this looking good. What I want to talk about is how you can get a camera to move in a really interesting way with a shot like this. So I'm going to turn back on that circle there, and you can see that I've kind of created this spline that sort of moves in this arc like that. And I just did that because I wanted to save us a little bit of time, but you can see really simple. You can just drop in a circle and turn it into an ellipse and go from there. So I've already kind of got that ready for us, and I'm going to drop in a camera, and then I'm going to use some tags to make this camera work for me. So I'm going to look through the camera, and then I'm going to add a Cinema 4D Align to Spline tag to the camera, and then I'm going to drag that circle as my spline onto the spline path. And then I can come in and start to edit the position. Now, when I do this, you can see I can't really see anything here. So I need to add another tag that is a target tag to the camera. And I'm going to tell it to look at my house. So I'm going to drop the house in as the target object. And now, really, really quickly, I've got this awesome little camera motion that I can animate over time if I want to, and kind of create maybe even like a loop or something, and get a really neat little look of this whole scene here. So that's a pretty cool way that you can work with something like that. So man, there's so many things that I could go in and show you about all of this stuff. One thing that I find really helpful in making this look nice is using the physical sky. That is going to be something that you're only going to have access to in certain forms of Cinema 4D. But I find that just going in and choosing a really nice preset, and then, you know, choosing the right time and location can really help to add to a shot that you might want to have, you know, some really special lighting to it. Something like this is really going to have a lot of difference made by just going in and doing something like that. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that this background kind of clashes by having these more realistic looking clouds. So what you can do is, with a physical sky, go into your Cinema 4D tags, add a compositing tag, and turn off the scene by camera checkbox. Then what you're going to get is some nice looking lighting without the physical sky. Now, I do still have this fog in here, so I need to go in there to my basic tab and turn off the fog, and that should get rid of what we were seeing there in the sky. So then you're going to get your nice reflections, your nice lighting, and not have to have that crazy thing going on in the background. And then you can just add a solid that's kind of like this blue color here when you composite it later on. So that's a really easy way to get some beautiful lighting for something like this, and then play around with the daytime, something like that. Now, one of the things I've been noticing as we've been going through here is our aliasing. So just a quick little render to the picture viewer shows we've got some really aliased edges in there. So let's very quickly go into our render settings, and I'll just show you that if you very quickly go to your anti-aliasing tab and change this from geometry to best, you're going to get way better results when you render to your picture viewer, or whenever you actually render this out. You can see, just kind of looking in there, the main difference that you get. And the render time is increased a little bit, but not to the point that that's going to be crippling. From just added about 10 seconds to that render. Now, where you are going to see an increase in render time is if you go in and you add something like just better sampling to your render. So a lot of times I will, in an animation, like to change that to a Gauss filter for animation. And I usually actually like to use the physical renderer. So then I'll go into my physical tab and change this from low to medium. So you can see I have that set to medium there. Now this is going to increase my render time a little bit more, but you can see that is just prettier. It's a little bit blurrier, but it really helps to reduce with things like flickering whenever you have an animated render. So if you had it on a camera kind of dolly arc like we did, you're definitely going to want to do that, especially with low poly, because you have so many little things kind of interpenetrating each other. You really can start to run into some bad flickering. So that Gauss is a great way to turn that off. Now, one thing that really does any render a lot of good is just coming in here and saying ambient occlusion, get in there. You can even go in there and maybe turn up your contrast a little bit. And that's going to just add one more nice little element. So you can see kind of right in there. Now I'm getting some really nice little dark shadows. And it's just a combination of all of those things that you're adding in there to make it more and more and more beautiful. Now, one thing that I also would like to recommend is if you're doing this option here where you've got the sky that you aren't rendering the actual sky and you're going to composite it later, just make sure within those render settings that you do go in and when you're in your save, you turn on alpha channel. And I usually like to separate my alpha if I'm going to go ahead and composite it. I'll usually check that on as well. So then you could render something like this out and then composite a nice little gradient or something like that in the background. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial on how to create that low poly look in Cinema 4D, and be sure to check back to DT and our blog for more free tutorials.